She's just the babysitter? Brittany's voice cracked through the air like a snapped rope. Heads turned, forks froze, and the hum of conversation fell into an odd hush. Every eye seemed to weigh me, measure me, then file me under. Less than? I stood there holding the photo album I'd brought, arms locked to keep my hands from shaking. Daniel, my son, didn't look at me. He studied the lake beyond the deck rail, as if there were something urgent floating out there. Brittany leaned back in her chair, a smile pressed into something sharper. Her friends glanced between us, half grinning, waiting for more. I could hear the clink of ice in her glass as she swirled it, lazy, pleased. My jaw tightened. I'd buried my husband in the cold ground 36 years ago, then worked every hour God gave me to keep Daniel fed, clothed, and moving forward. 3 jobs, 7 days a week. Now, to his wife, I was a footnote, a punchline. I stepped closer to the long table. The wood under my sandals groaned. Brittany's gaze stayed locked on mine, daring me to answer. I gave her the smallest smile I could manage. Nice to see you too, I said, voice steady as stone. No one laughed, but no one stopped her either. Daniel cleared his throat, fiddled with his cuff button. Brittany broke eye contact first, tilting her head toward the woman on her right, whispering just loud enough for the sound to carry. I pulled out a chair at the edge of the gathering. From here, I could see the whole line of them. Relatives, in-laws, strangers with my blood somewhere in their veins. They turned back to their plates, the moment already fading for them. Not for me. I opened the album on my lap. Daniel at 5, grinning without his front teeth. Me beside him, hair loose from a long day shelving books at the library, eyes tired but lit up because he was mine. Those nights I'd come home smelling of dust and paper, counting coins for rent while he slept. Brittany's voice carried again. I just think it's sweet she could make it, since she must be busy watching other people's kids. A titter of laughter rolled down the table. That's the cruelty of this kind of betrayal. It wears polite clothes. It smiles while it twists the knife. And it comes from people who should know better. I closed the album gently. They didn't need to see what was inside. Not yet. What Brittany didn't know, what Daniel had apparently never bothered to mention, was that I owned part of this very resort. A quiet investment, gifted years ago by a friend who believed in me when I'd almost stopped believing in myself. One phone call, and this little party could change shape in minutes, but timing is everything. Quiet revenge isn't about striking fast, it's about striking right. I watched Brittany laugh with her friends, confident she'd set me in my place. Daniel sipped his drink, eyes down, shoulders drawn. For a moment, I almost pitied them. Almost. The deck boards creaked as the catering manager walked past, nodding politely to me. He knew who signed part of his paycheck. Brittany didn't notice? I sat straighter, letting my presence settle back into the space they'd tried to shrink me out of. I'd been invisible before. I knew how to make that work in my favor. The talk at the table swelled again, harmless chatter about vacations and houses and cars. But under it, I felt the pulse of something steady and cold resolve. I glanced at the album again. One day soon, they'd remember this moment, not for Brittany's words, but for what followed, for the way the babysitter decided to write the ending herself. If you were sitting here, hearing your own family strip you down to less than you are, would you fight back or walk away? I woke before the sun, as I always did back then. The house on Willow Street was small, its walls thin enough for winter winds to slip through. But it was ours. I'd stand in the kitchen, wrapping my hands around a chipped mug, waiting for the kettle's whistle. That quiet moment before Daniel woke was my only pause in a day already claimed by others. When the library opened at 8, I was there shelving returns, breathing in the dry scent of old pages. It wasn't glamorous work, but it kept a roof over us. At 5, I'd trade the hush of books for the chaos of babysitting, neighbor kids spilling toys across the carpet, homework half done while I stirred macaroni on the stove. By midnight, I'd be on my knees in the cabins by the lake, scrubbing tile floors until my back ached. Those years blurred together, but I remember the little victories. Daniel's smile when he brought home a perfect spelling test. The day I finally paid off the old sedan, its engine coughing but reliable enough to get him to soccer practice. We never had much, but we had each other. After his father died in the mine collapse, the world shifted hard. The life we'd planned, steady paycheck, weekends fishing, vanished in a phone call. There was no insurance payout, no safety net, just me, a boy with big eyes and bills piling like snowdrifts.
Still, I kept going.
I learned to stretch a pot of stew for 3 days, to patch school pants until the fabric thinned to air. I made sure Daniel never missed a field trip, even if it meant taking an extra cleaning shift. One winter night, after my third job, I sat at the cabin desk where guests usually signed in. The owner, a man named Henry Palmer, came in carrying 2 mugs of coffee. He set one in front of me and said, "Margaret, you've got grit. Ever thought about investing?" I laughed. Me invest. But he told me about shares in the resort, how even a small stake could grow if the place thrived. I scraped together what little I could over months, signing papers with hands still smelling of bleach. I never told Daniel. It felt like a secret hope, something just mine. I didn't know then how important that choice would become, how it would stand between me and the kind of humiliation Brittany delivered years later. Back in those early days, my reward was simpler: a warm bed, a boy sleeping soundly down the hall, and the quiet knowledge that no matter how hard the day had been, I'd met it head-on. As the years rolled on, the resort shares became something I rarely thought about. They were buried under the demands of daily life, school meetings, late shifts, and Daniel's endless sports practices. Every dividend check went straight into a savings account I never touched, as if it belonged to a different future. Daniel grew tall and sure-footed, with that same quick smile his father once had. By high school, he was working part-time at the hardware store, talking about college like it was a train already on the tracks. I sat in the bleachers at his graduation, clutching a small bouquet, feeling the weight of every extra hour I'd worked to get him there. He didn't know about the second-hand dress I'd tailored myself, or the fact that I'd walked to the ceremony to save gas. When he left for university in the city, the house felt cavernous. I filled the evenings with extra library shifts and long walks along the lake, the same lake that mirrored every season of our lives. It was during one of those walks that I passed the resort and saw the renovations Henry had started. Fresh paint on the cabins, new docks stretching into the water. I felt a quiet pride. My small stake was part of something thriving. Over time, Daniel's visits home grew shorter. He'd arrive with laundry and leave with leftovers, his mind already on the next project, the next trip. I didn't blame him. The world was wide, and I'd raised him to step into it without fear. Still, there were moments, like the Thanksgiving he called from an airport gate, that left the house echoing too loud. When he met Brittany, I welcomed her with open arms. She was sharp, stylish, and spoke about business with an ease I admired. I told myself that Daniel had found someone who matched his ambition, but small signs crept in, her sidelong glances when I mentioned my work, the way she'd redirect conversations away from our past. I never offered up the truth about my connection to the resort. It wasn't secrecy born of mistrust. It was a piece of myself I kept separate, like a lockbox only I could open. Perhaps part of me sensed that one day, the balance between us might shift, and I would need something solid to stand on. Looking back, the years of sacrifice weren't just about survival. They were laying a foundation, brick by hard-earned brick, for a moment I didn't yet see coming. A moment when the babysitter would decide exactly how the story would turn. It started with little digs, the kind you could almost excuse as careless. At a Sunday brunch, Brittany waved me over just to ask if I'd mind keeping the kids busy so the adults could talk. I was standing right there with a coffee cup in hand, wearing my best blouse. Daniel chuckled like it was nothing, and I swallowed my reply. But that afternoon at their house, the tone shifted. I'd brought a pie, pecan, the way Daniel liked it since he was 12. Brittany took it from me, set it on the counter without a thank you, and said, "You really don't have to fuss. Store-bought would have been fine." Her smile didn't touch her eyes. I busied myself with setting plates, listening to their chatter about a new investment they were making. Something in her voice, brisk, self-satisfied, reminded me of people at the resort board meetings, the ones who underestimated me before they knew who I was. Midway through lunch, Daniel mentioned the resort, bragging about a recent family stay there. Brittany leaned forward, fork in hand, and said, "We should take Mom there sometime. She could show the kids the cabins she used to clean." The table went quiet for half a beat before polite laughter bubbled up. I felt heat climb my neck. Daniel didn't correct her. He didn't say a word about the truth, that I hadn't been on my knees with a scrub brush there in years, that I'd sat in boardrooms making decisions about those cabins. Instead, he speared another bite of roast and changed the subject. In that silence, I understood something important. This wasn't about ignorance. It was about erasure. Brittany wanted me in a smaller box, one she could label and set aside. And Daniel, he was letting her. I glanced at the pie on the counter, untouched. The smell of roasted pecans still clung to my hands from the kitchen at home. Once, that scent meant comfort. Now it tasted of something else. Dismissal. I cleared plates while they lingered at the table, their voices low, occasionally glancing my way. Every scrape of cutlery into the sink felt like another inch taken from the space I once held in my son's life. Driving home later, the afternoon sun flashed between the bare trees lining the road. Each flicker felt like a metronome marking time I couldn't get back. I gripped the wheel tighter, replaying Brittany's words, Daniel's silence over and over. By the time I reached my driveway, the resolve had already started to settle in. Not the kind that explodes in shouting, but the quiet kind that plans, waits, and chooses its moment. They thought they knew who I was. They'd find out soon enough how wrong they were. 2 weeks later, I saw them again at a cousin's birthday dinner. The restaurant was one of those dimly lit places where every table seemed to lean into the next. I arrived a few minutes early, chose a seat near the middle, hoping to be part of the flow. But when Daniel and Brittany walked in, she scanned the table and said brightly, "Oh, Mom, why don't you sit down there by the end? You'll have more space." Her hand hovered, pointing toward a corner seat next to the coat rack. I smiled, moved without comment, and let her think it was her idea. From my new vantage point, I could see them clearly, her hand resting on his arm, her laughter a little too sharp when someone brought up the resort's upcoming gala. "I'm sure we'll get an invitation," she said, "especially if Daniel's board application goes through." She didn't glance my way. No one at that table knew I already had a vote in those applications. When the appetizers arrived, she waved the waiter over. "Could you bring my mother-in-law some bread? She prefers simple food." The words landed like a stone in water, small ripple, then stillness. I thanked the waiter, tore the bread in half, and chewed slowly, each bite buying me another moment to think. I caught Daniel's eyes once. He gave me a brief, tight smile before looking away. It was the same look he'd worn as a boy when caught between telling the truth and keeping a friend. This time, the stakes were higher. After the candles were blown out and the cake was sliced, I lingered to help the staff clear plates. Brittany passed by with her coat draped over one arm. "Don't worry about that, Margaret," she said softly. "You've done enough for today." Then she walked off, leaving the faint echo of her perfume and the heavier weight of her meaning. Outside, the night air was cold enough to sting my cheeks. I stood by my car for a moment, watching my breath cloud and fade. There was no single, explosive insult to point to, just a pattern, deliberate in its quiet precision. She was drawing lines and Daniel was letting her. Driving home, I thought of the ledger I kept in my desk drawer. Every dividend from the resort, every letter from Henry in the early days, every update from the board secretary. It was all there, neat and in order. Proof not just of ownership, but of presence, of roots too deep for Brittany to cut with a sentence. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the insult had hardened into something sharper. Not rage, that burns out. Resolve, that lasts. They wanted me small and silent. I could be silent for now. Small, though? Never. The first hint came in an envelope slipped under my front door. Inside was a neatly folded letter from Daniel, written on the stationery of some law office in the city. It was worded politely, almost coldly, asking me to review and sign a set of attached documents that would simplify our family's financial holdings. No details, no phone call, just a signature line and a courier envelope. I set it on the kitchen table, beside the mug of tea I'd been drinking. Steam still rose from the cup, but my stomach tightened. I'd learned long ago that anything requiring haste and silence was rarely in my favor. That weekend, Daniel came by. Brittany trailed behind him, all charm and perfume, carrying a folder. "We just thought it would be easier for everyone if things were streamlined," she said, sliding into my dining chair like it belonged to her. Daniel added, "It's just legal housekeeping, Mom. No big deal." I opened the folder. The first page was full of cheerful language about consolidation and trust management. By the third page, I found a clause that would transfer my voting shares in the resort to Daniel. No compensation, no safeguards. Just gone. I looked up at him. "You think I don't read what's in front of me?" His cheeks colored, but he didn't answer. Brittany leaned forward. "It's better this way. You don't need the stress of board meetings and decisions. You've done enough?" The words stung more than I expected. Not because of the lie. They didn't care about my well-being, but because they were erasing the years of grit it took to have those shares at all. Every late, night cleaning shift, every blistered hand from scrubbing cabin floors, every book I shelved at the library when I should have been sleeping. I set the papers down. My answer is no, I said, evenly. Brittany's smile didn't falter, but her eyes narrowed just enough to show the truth. Daniel started to speak, then stopped, as if he'd already lost the argument in his head. They stayed a few minutes longer, making small talk about weather and traffic. When they left, Brittany's perfume lingered in the doorway, cloying and heavy. I locked the door behind them. At the table the documents still lay open, their black ink sharp against the white paper. I traced the lines with my finger, thinking of Henry's advice years ago. Ownership is power. Margaret. Never hand it over unless you're ready to lose the ground beneath your feet. That night I tucked the folder into my desk drawer, under the ledger where I kept every dividend statement. If they wanted a fight over numbers, I would have more than memory to stand on. I'd have proof, and I would decide when to use it. The following Monday, I took the bus into town. Snow had begun to crust along the sidewalks, the kind that squeaks underfoot. I carried the folder in my bag, tucked between an old checkbook and a scarf. If Daniel and Brittany thought I would sign away my holdings without question, they had forgotten who raised him. At the bank, the manager, Mr. Keller, greeted me with a warm handshake. We'd known each other for years. He'd seen me open my first account after Henry sold me those shares. I need to review the status of my investments, I told him. He nodded, led me to his office, and closed the door. I laid the documents on his desk. He read them slowly, lips tightening at the same sections that had stopped me cold. These would transfer your voting rights and a portion of your dividend income into a managed trust, controlled by your son, he said carefully. Once signed, reversing this would be difficult. Difficult wasn't the right word. It would be impossible. I asked for copies of my current shareholder agreements, my dividend history, and any correspondence between the resort board and my account. He gathered the files without hesitation. Years of careful record, keeping meant everything was in order. My name, my signature, my rights intact. As I slipped the papers back into my bag, I felt the weight of them in a way I hadn't before. This wasn't just paper, it was leverage. It was history written in ink and numbers, proof that my seat at the table was earned, not gifted. On the way home, I stopped at the post office and rented a small lockbox. If Daniel and Brittany wanted to play games with documents, I'd keep the originals where only I could reach them. The duplicates I'd keep at home, filed neatly, in case I needed to pull them quickly. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table spreading the papers out in careful rows. The yellow light from the lamp caught the embossed letterhead, the neat lines of my own handwriting from years ago. Henry's voice echoed in my head, "Ownership is power, Margaret. Protect it like you'd protect your own name." The kettle whistled, and I poured myself a cup of tea. Outside, the streetlights flickered on, casting long shadows across the snow. I thought about Brittany's polite smile, Daniel's averted eyes, and the quiet certainty that they believed I wouldn't resist. They were wrong. I gathered the papers, slid them into the desk drawer beside my ledger, and turned the key. From here on, every move I made would be deliberate. No confrontation yet, just the slow, steady laying of groundwork. Because when the time came to answer their betrayal, I wouldn't raise my voice. I would raise the truth, in front of the one crowd that mattered, and watch the balance shift back where it belonged. It began subtly, the way frost creeps across a window, thin lines you almost miss until the whole pane is covered. One week I wasn't invited to Sunday lunch. The next, a family group photo appeared on Brittany's social media, all smiles in matching sweaters, taken at the pumpkin patch where Daniel used to beg me for kettle corn. No one had mentioned the trip. I told myself they were busy, that young families moved fast. But the calls slowed to a trickle. When they did come, they were short, functional. "We can't make it this weekend." Or, "The kids have a game." The warmth in Daniel's voice was fading, replaced by something measured, cautious. One Thursday afternoon, I stopped by their house unannounced, a container of chicken soup in my hands. Through the front window, I saw Brittany at the kitchen island, her phone propped up for a video call. Daniel was leaning against the counter, sipping coffee. I rang the bell. Brittany glanced toward the door, then turned back to the phone. Daniel opened it a crack. "Oh, Mom, we're just in the middle of something. Can we catch up later? He didn't invite me in." Walking back to my car, the soup still warm against my palms, I realized it wasn't business. It was intentional. The one person who seemed untouched by whatever story Brittany was spinning was Emily, my 12-year-old granddaughter. She started calling me on her own, always from her room with the door closed. "Hi, Grandma," she'd whisper, as if the conversation was contraband. She asked about my garden, about the lake, about the old stories of Daniel's childhood she loved to hear. One Saturday, she convinced Daniel to drop her off for a quick visit. We made cookies, the way I used to with him. Flour dust in our hair, laughter spilling into the kitchen. Before she left, she pressed a folded note into my hand. "They don't want me to tell you," she said softly, "but I heard Dad and Mom talking. They said you might not be part of the next family trip." I sat on the porch after she left, the note still warm from her hand. The late autumn wind rattled the bare branches overhead. It wasn't the trip that stung. It was the confirmation that I was being pushed further out, step by step, until the door closed completely. Inside, I put the note in my ledger, between the dividend statements and the resort minutes. It didn't belong there by category, but it belonged there by meaning. Evidence of a different sort. The house felt quieter than usual that night. Not the comforting quiet of rest, but the hollow kind where absence presses against the walls. I sat at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug I never sipped from, thinking of all the dinners, the birthdays, the scraped knees I'd been part of, and how quickly people rewrite the guest list when it suits them. The first snow had barely settled when I learned about the Christmas gathering. Not from Daniel, not from Brittany, but from a neighbor who'd seen the whole family loading suitcases into their SUV. "They looked like they were headed somewhere warm," she said, tugging her coat tighter against the wind. That evening, my phone buzzed. It was Emily. Her voice was low, urgent. "Grandma, they told me not to call you. We're going to the cabin for Christmas. Mom says it's just easier without extra people." The pause before, "extra people," was like a paper cut, small, but sharp enough to sting every time you think about it. I didn't ask her to explain. She was 12. She shouldn't have to. Instead, I told her I loved her and to have a wonderful time, but when we hung up, the silence in my living room pressed down hard. I could almost hear the ghost of wrapping paper tearing, the echo of laughter over a board game, the crackle of the fire at the cabin's hearth. On Christmas morning, I kept my routine: coffee, oatmeal, the radio tuned low. Outside, the lake was frozen solid, a white sheet under the pale sky. I stayed away from the phone, not wanting to see their photos scroll past, each one a reminder that I had been erased from the frame. Around noon, a knock at the door broke the stillness. It was Emily again, bundled in her coat, cheeks pink from the cold. She stepped inside quickly, a small package in her hands. "I told them I was going for a walk," she whispered. Inside the box was a snow globe, our lake, complete with the little dock encased in glass. When I shook it, the flakes drifted down slow and quiet, settling over the frozen scene. "They didn't see me take it from the gift pile," she admitted, eyes wide but proud. I hugged her, feeling the weight of her loyalty, the risk she'd taken just to let me know I wasn't forgotten by everyone. She stayed only a few minutes, glancing at the clock. When she left, the cold rushed back in with the open door. I stood there for a long time, watching her small figure disappear down the road toward the life I was no longer invited to share. That night, I placed the snow globe on the mantel, next to the ledger. It didn't belong there by any practical measure, but it had earned its place among the things I intended to remember. The ledger held numbers and signatures. The snow globe held the proof of something more important, that even in a house gone quiet, there was still a thread connecting me to someone who saw me. And as the wind howled off the lake, rattling the windows, I felt that thread tighten, not fray. Isolation might be what they wanted for me, but it would not be where my story ended. The invitation arrived in the mail, embossed and heavy, smelling faintly of expensive ink. Brittany's handwriting danced across the envelope. "Family Appreciation Dinner, Lakeside Resort." No personal note, just the date and time. I almost laughed. She hadn't looked me in the eye for months, and now I was welcome at a public event she clearly expected me to attend as background decor. The night of the dinner, the resort's ballroom glittered with gold light. Crystal chandeliers cast halos across the polished floor, and the air buzzed with the low hum of conversation. I walked in wearing a navy dress I'd kept for board meetings, the one with the clean lines that made people take me seriously. Brittany spotted me from across the room. Her smile was wide, practiced. She glided over, one hand holding a champagne flute. "So glad you could make it," she said, voice just loud enough for the nearby tables. Daniel and I were worried you might feel out of place. I met her gaze. Why would I feel that way? As she tilted her head, as if the answer were obvious. Oh, well, it's just, these gatherings can be overwhelming for someone not used to the business side of things. We both knew she wasn't talking about business. Dinner was a long table dressed in white linen, seating arranged with surgical precision. Brittany placed me at the far end, next to a man I didn't recognize, away from the central conversation. From here, I had a perfect view of her and Daniel, framed in the glow of the chandeliers, holding court like they owned the place. Halfway through the meal, Brittany rose with her glass. I'd like to thank everyone here, she began, for contributing to the success of our resort community. And of course, a special mention to family members who've been part of our journey. Whether by support or simply by cheering us on from the sidelines, a polite ripple of laughter moved through the room. My fork hovered above my plate. I felt every eye slide toward me, just for a second, as if to confirm I was indeed one of those sidelines she spoke of. I set my fork down, folding my hands in my lap. The urge to answer her in front of everyone was sharp, but I held it back. Quiet power has more weight when you let others underestimate you first. As she sat, Daniel leaned in to whisper something to her, and they both smiled. To anyone else, it looked like a picture of unity. To me, it was a snapshot of two people certain they'd secured the narrative. The rest of the meal passed in a blur of polite conversation and clinking glasses. I spoke little, preferring to listen, to watch the way Brittany scanned the room, always aware of who was looking at her. She thrived on being the center, and I knew exactly how to shift the center without raising my voice. When dessert arrived, I caught the eye of the resort's general manager, standing discreetly near the door. He gave a subtle nod. We'd spoken earlier in the week, in an office far from Brittany's reach. If she thought tonight was hers alone to orchestrate, she was about to learn that the stage belonged to whoever controlled the lights. The moment came between dessert and coffee service. The lights dimmed slightly, not enough to alarm anyone, just enough to draw attention to the projection screen at the far end of the room. The general manager stepped forward with a microphone, his voice warm but clear. Before we close tonight's program, we'd like to recognize one of our longest-standing contributors to the Lakeside Resort's success, someone whose dedication and investment have quietly shaped the very place we're sitting in now. I saw Brittany's head turn toward the stage, curiosity flickering. Daniel straightened, glancing down the table as if trying to guess the name. The manager continued, "Please join me in thanking our shareholder, board member, and friend, Mrs. Margaret O'Connor." For a heartbeat, the room was silent. Then the applause began, polite at first, then warmer as faces turned toward me. The man beside me stood to shake my hand. Across the table, Brittany's smile froze in place, her eyes locked on me like she'd just spotted a crack in the floor beneath her. I rose slowly, letting the moment stretch. "Thank you," I said, my voice carrying easily in the hushed room. "I've been proud to watch this resort grow, and to play my part in that growth. It's a reminder that support isn't always about standing on the sidelines. Sometimes it's about helping to build the stage." A ripple of quiet laughter and nods moved through the guests. Brittany's hand tightened on the stem of her glass. Daniel looked away first. The general manager presented me with a small plaque, the resort's crest engraved in brass. I accepted it, then sat, placing it calmly beside my plate. The gesture was simple, but its weight wasn't lost on anyone, least of all Brittany. For the rest of the evening, conversation shifted. Guests who'd barely glanced my way earlier now stopped to shake my hand, thank me for my contributions, ask how long I'd been involved. Brittany smiled through it all, her laughter pitched just a little too high, her gaze darting toward Daniel as if for reassurance. I stayed until the final toast, making sure to speak with the staff as we left the ballroom. They knew me, not as a guest, but as someone who'd been part of their paychecks for years. Every handshake, every "good night, O'Connor," was another thread in the fabric Brittany couldn't see, much less control. Outside, the winter air was sharp against my skin. The lake lay dark and still beyond the frosted railings, the resort lights reflected in its surface. I breathed it in, slow and steady, feeling the kind of satisfaction that doesn't need an audience. Brittany had tried to make me small in front of a crowd. Tonight, without raising my voice, I'd reminded her, and everyone else, that my place here wasn't hers to define. And this was just the beginning. 2 weeks after the dinner, I stopped by the resort's administrative office to drop off a signed set of minutes from the last board meeting. The reception area was quiet, just the low hum of a space heater near the desk. Carla, the board secretary, greeted me with her usual smile and a stack of mail. "These were addressed to you, but delivered here by mistake," she said, sliding the envelopes across the counter. Most were routine dividend notices, tax documents, but one caught my eye. It was from a law firm I didn't recognize, with Daniel's name printed faintly in the CC line through the thin paper. I slipped it into my bag without opening it there. Back home, I made tea and sat at the kitchen table. The letter was formal, outlining a proposed restructuring of resort equity holdings that would consolidate minor shareholders into family trusts for efficiency. Attached was a draft plan showing my shares, my voting rights, transferred to a trust under Daniel's name. With Brittany listed as successor trustee, it was dated 3 months ago, before the dinner, before the so-called housekeeping documents they'd tried to hand me. My stomach tightened. This wasn't just an idea tossed around over coffee, it was a plan already in motion. They'd filed preliminary inquiries with the county registrar, pending my consent. If I hadn't read this, I might have learned about it only when it was too late to stop. I went to the desk in the living room, pulling out the ledger and laying the letter beside it. The evidence was starting to stack. First the pressure to sign, then the quiet exclusion from family events, and now a paper trail of their intentions. Flipping through the ledger, I found Henry's earliest notes on my purchase of the shares. His handwriting slanted, ink slightly faded. "Margaret, keep originals safe. People forget what you've earned. They'll try to take it if you let them." The words felt less like advice now, and more like a warning from the past. The phone rang. It was Emily. She spoke quickly, almost breathless. "Grandma." Mom was on the phone with someone about paperwork for the transfer. "She told Dad they need you to resign before the next quarter, or the timing won't work." I could hear muffled voices in the background. Brittany's tone sharp, Daniel's low and uneasy. "Thank you for telling me," I said. She hesitated. "Are you okay?" "Yes," I told her. "Better than they think." After we hung up, I sat in the quiet for a long time, the winter light slanting pale across the table. Every instinct told me to act quickly, but the wiser part of me, the one honed over decades of hard work, knew better. This would require patience and precision. I gathered the documents, slid them into a manila folder, and placed it in the lockbox at the post office. When I left, the snow was falling in slow, steady flakes. Each one seemed deliberate the way I intended to be. They thought the pieces were moving in their favor. What they didn't realize was that I'd just flipped the board. The next morning I drove into town early, the roads still quiet under a thin layer of frost. Instead of heading straight to the resort, I parked in front of the county courthouse. The public records office was on the second floor, a long, narrow room lined with metal filing cabinets and the faint smell of old paper. A clerk named Marcia looked up from her desk. "Morning, Mrs. O'Connor. What can I help you with today?" I explained that I wanted to review any recent filings involving the Lakeside Resort and trusts connected to my family name. She nodded, disappearing into the rows of cabinets. When she returned, she carried a small stack of files. One envelope bore Daniel's name in bold, Brittany's in smaller print beneath. Inside was a draft deed of transfer, my shares listed, along with a blank signature line labeled "Current Owner." It was stamped, "Pending execution." The document was meticulous. It even outlined how voting rights would shift immediately upon signature, bypassing the next board election. A small note in the margin caught my eye, contingent upon unanimous family consent. They were counting on my agreement to make it airtight. I asked Marcia for certified copies of everything and paid in cash. As she stamped each page, I felt the weight of the proof growing in my hands. No more guessing, no more hearsay. This was tangible evidence. On the way out, I stopped at the notary desk. "Could you notarize a statement for me?" I asked. I wrote in clear block letters that I had not and would not authorize any transfer of my shares, and that any document suggesting otherwise was fraudulent. The notary signed and sealed it, handing it back with a crisp snap of the page. From there, I walked to the small law office of Richard Evans, an attorney I'd known since Henry first helped me invest. He listened without interrupting as I laid the documents on his desk in neat order. When I finished, he leaned back. "They've built a paper trail, but you've got the advantage. You have original purchase records, dividend histories, and now certified evidence of their attempt." If they push, we can shut this down before it breathes. I left his office with a plan forming. Not the full shape yet, but the spine of it. Every step they took from here would be matched with one of mine, quieter but stronger. Back home, I added the new documents to the lockbox at the post office. It was starting to feel like a vault of leverage, each piece a layer of armor. On the mantel, the snow globe Emily had given me caught the afternoon light, scattering it in small, steady glints. I stood there for a moment, watching the flakes inside drift down over the tiny dock. They settled slowly, exactly where they were meant to. Patience, I reminded myself, wasn't just waiting, it was preparing. And when the time came, I'd be ready to tip the whole thing over. That night, sleep refused to come. I lay in bed staring at the faint pattern of streetlight shadows on the ceiling, the quiet of the house thick as a blanket I couldn't push off. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Daniel's signature line, empty and waiting, and Brittany's name printed just beneath it. I got up, pulled on my robe, and padded into the kitchen. The clock over the stove read 2:14 a.m. I set the kettle on, the click of the burner loud in the stillness. From the window above the sink, the lake was a strip of silver under the moon, ice crusting along the edges. I thought of Martin, my late husband, sitting at this same table years ago, shuffling bills and pay stubs into neat piles. He'd look up at me with that steady gaze and say, "You protect what you've built, Maggie. No one's going to do it for you." Back then, he meant our little house, the savings jar we kept behind the flour tin. Now those words stretched over something much larger. I carried my tea to the living room, lit only by the lamp near the mantel. The snow globe Emily had given me sat there, its glass catching the dim light. I shook it gently, watching the flakes drift down. Inside, the dock stood untouched, steady under the weight of the snow. It felt like a promise. The ledger was already on the coffee table, open to the most recent dividend entry. Beside it, the manila folder of certified documents and the notarized statement. I flipped through each page slowly, memorizing the order, the dates, the signatures. These weren't just defenses, they were stepping stones. Somewhere between the third and fourth cup of tea, a framework began to take shape. Not a reckless strike, but a series of moves timed to their own steps. If they tried to bring the paperwork to the board without my consent, I'd have the proof ready for every member to see. If they pushed through back channels, I'd take it to the shareholders directly. I wrote notes in a small spiral-bound pad, each bullet point a countermeasure. Contact Richard to draft a preemptive filing with the county. Alert Carla at the board office to flag any submission with my name. Meet quietly with 2 other long-standing shareholders, people who remembered Henry and respected his judgment. By the time the first pale light seeped through the curtains, my fatigue had settled into something sharper resolve. I stacked the documents back into the folder, returned the ledger to its drawer, and set the snow globe squarely in the center of the mantel. They wanted me out quietly. What they didn't understand was that I had learned the value of quiet long before Brittany came into my life, and I knew how to use it. By mid-morning, the winter sun was low but bright, cutting long bars of light across the kitchen floor. I'd slept no more than an hour, yet my mind was sharper than it had been in weeks. The notes from the night sat on the counter, neat and deliberate, each one a step toward holding my ground. The first call I made was to Richard Evans. His voice came warm and steady through the line. "I'm ready to move forward," I told him. Within the hour, he drafted a notice to be filed with the county, a formal statement that no transfer of my shares could occur without my direct, notarized approval. It wasn't aggression, it was a boundary in black ink. Next, I walked to the post office and checked the lockbox. The folder of certified documents was exactly as I'd left it, sealed and safe. I added a copy of Richard's new filing, tucking it between the ledger and the notarized refusal. Each layer felt like another brick in a wall they wouldn't be able to climb. From there, I made my way to the lakeside diner, the kind of place where you could have a conversation without it feeling like a meeting. Waiting for me in the corner booth were Tom Willis and Clara Bennett, 2 of the oldest shareholders on the board. We'd weathered plenty of storms together over the years. Over coffee, I explained, briefly, what had been set in motion and what I intended to do. Tom's jaw tightened. "Henry trusted you for a reason," he said. Clara nodded. "You've got our votes. Margaret, whatever you need." It wasn't a public alliance, but it was exactly the kind of quiet reinforcement I needed. Back home, I called Carla at the board office. I kept my tone casual, asking her to flag any submissions involving my name. She agreed without hesitation, promising to let me know if anything crossed her desk. That small promise felt like a sentry post planted right at the gate. As the day wore on, I felt the shift, not in their actions but in my readiness. Every step I took was invisible to Daniel and Brittany, which was exactly how I wanted it. They believed silence meant weakness. What they didn't see was the scaffolding I was building under that silence. By late afternoon, the lake had turned to molten gold under the setting sun. I stood at the window, watching the light fade, the snow on the shore untouched except for a single line of fox tracks. Patience, I reminded myself, was not the same as inaction. When the phone rang that evening, I let it go to voicemail. Brittany's voice floated through the machine, sweet as sugar. "Margaret, we'd love to have you over for dinner next week. Just the family, to talk things through." I erased the message without listening to the rest. They could talk when I was ready. And by then, I wouldn't just be holding my ground. I'd be choosing the battlefield. The first step was money. Not theirs, mine. Over the years, Daniel and Brittany had grown accustomed to the quiet support I provided, paying for upgrades at their house under the guise of early inheritance, covering the difference on family vacations, even writing checks for Daniel's business when cash flow ran tight. All of it done without fanfare and without repayment. That stopped on a Tuesday morning. I sat at my desk with my checkbook closed, the pen tucked away. From this day forward, not a cent would leave my accounts without a purpose that served me, not them. I started by calling the bank to review every joint or linked account. There were two, both set up years ago to make emergencies easier. I had the manager remove their access within the hour. When she asked if I wanted to notify them, I smiled faintly. No. If they need to know, they'll figure it out. And next was the credit card Daniel had for family expenses. I canceled it. The representative on the phone offered to send a final statement. "Yes," I said, "and make sure the cancellation is immediate." The balance was low, but the gesture mattered. It was the first brick pulled from under their comfortable footing. At the resort, I reviewed the shareholder benefit ledger. Daniel had been using my membership privileges, discounted bookings, priority event reservations. Without asking, I instructed the general manager to flag my account no reservations under my name without my explicit approval. His eyebrows lifted slightly, but he nodded. "Understood, Mrs. O'Connor." By the end of the week, I'd closed the gaps that had let them dip into my resources. It wasn't loud. There were no confrontations, just quiet shifts in access and control, each one leaving them a little more on their own. Emily noticed first. She called one evening, her voice cautious. "Dad's been stressed." "Mom, too." "They keep saying something about the bank being difficult." I told her not to worry about me. "That's the thing, Grandma," she whispered. "I'm not worried about you. I'm worried about them. They're not used to you saying no." I didn't tell her that. No, was just the beginning. This wasn't revenge for its own sake. It was leverage. Without my steady hand feeding the gaps in their plans, the cracks would spread faster than they realized. One quiet night, I sat by the fireplace, ledger open in my lap, snow globe beside it. The plan was still in motion, each step timed to match their next move. The less they suspected, the more effective it would be. Daniel and Brittany had built their confidence on the belief that I would always be there to patch the holes. Now, I was pulling the safety net away, thread by thread. By the following week, the financial walls around me were solid. It was time to work on the human ones. Money could close doors, but people, trusted, respected people, could keep them shut. I began with Tom and Clara, the shareholders I'd met at the diner. We arranged a quiet coffee at Tom's lakeside cabin. Snow drifted outside the wide windows while the three of us sat at a round table, the wood scarred from decades of use. I laid out the documents again, this time in chronological order, showing exactly how Daniel and Brittany had been positioning themselves. Clara traced a finger over the notary seal. "They're bolder than I thought." Tom grunted. "And careless. You've got them boxed in, Margaret. If the board sees this, they'll lose more than your shares." We agreed that when the time came, they'd back my motion to block any restructuring vote. More importantly, they'd help sway two undecided members, men who respected Tom's history and Clara's judgment. In a boardroom, loyalty often spoke louder than logic. Next, I visited the resort's general manager. We met in his office after hours, the only lighted desk lamp casting long shadows on the walls. "I want you to keep a log," I told him, "of any reservations, event requests, or financial transactions attempted under my name or my shareholder benefits. No matter how small. He didn't ask why, he simply agreed, sliding a fresh notebook from his desk drawer. At home, I updated the spiral-bound pad that had become my war map. Each name I could rely on went into one column, each vulnerability Daniel and Brittany exposed went into another. Slowly, the second column was starting to outweigh the first. Emily called again that Friday. "Dad's been talking about a big surprise for the board," she said. "He told Mom it would seal the deal." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Whatever it is, they think you won't see it coming." I thanked her, then sat for a long moment after we hung up. The irony wasn't lost on me. Every step they took toward their surprise only gave me more to work with, and they still had no idea how many eyes and ears were quietly feeding me pieces of their puzzle. That night, I lit the fireplace and poured myself a small glass of sherry. The snow globe sat on the mantel, its tiny lake frozen in place. I watched the flames flicker in the glass, the reflection bending and shifting like a future they couldn't control. When the time came to make my move, I wouldn't need to shout. I'd simply pull the right thread and let the rest unravel. The quiet plan was no longer just preparation. It was momentum. The board meeting was set for a Thursday afternoon in the resort's conference hall overlooking the frozen lake. Snow flurries swept past the wide windows as I walked in, a leather folder tucked under my arm. The long table gleamed under recessed lighting, each seat marked with a crisp nameplate. Daniel and Brittany were already there, standing close together at the far end. Brittany wore her sharpest suit, the kind meant to broadcast confidence. Daniel's jaw was set, his eyes avoiding mine. I could almost feel the hum of their anticipation. They thought today would be the day they closed the deal. Tom and Clara arrived moments after me, offering small nods as they took their seats. The other members shuffled papers, sipped coffee, made polite small talk. At precisely 2 o'clock, the chairperson called the meeting to order. Daniel rose, a folder in his hand. "Thank you, everyone," he began. "I'd like to propose a restructuring of shareholder equity to ensure a streamlined future for the resort. This plan consolidates smaller holdings into a family trust, allowing us to make decisions faster and with greater unity." He slid copies of the proposal down the table. The bold header carried his name and Brittany's. In the section marked "Current Owner Transfers," my name was printed neatly beside a blank signature line. I waited until every copy had been handed out. Then I opened my folder, pulling out the notarized refusal, the certified county documents, and the original purchase records in Henry's handwriting. I laid them on the table, the sound of the paper sharp in the quiet. "Before you read further," I said, my voice calm, "I'd like to enter into the record my formal rejection of this transfer, filed with the county registrar and notarized." I passed the documents to the chairperson, who examined them closely before nodding. A murmur moved through the room. Tom leaned forward. "Madam Chair, if these documents stand, this proposal cannot move forward without Mrs. O'Connor's consent, which, clearly, she has not given." Brittany's smile thinned, but she stayed seated. Daniel's face flushed, a muscle jumping in his cheek. "This is just a misunderstanding," he said. "We can sort it out privately." I met his gaze, steady and unblinking. "No, Daniel. We'll sort it out here, with the board that deserves the truth." The chairperson set the proposal aside. "In light of this evidence, the restructuring motion is tabled indefinitely." Her gavel came down with a firm tap. In that moment, the balance shifted. They'd walked in expecting to take something from me. Instead, they'd been forced to watch me fortify my place, in full view of the people who mattered most. The air in the room shifted after the gavel fell. Conversations that had been polite a moment earlier now carried an edge, the kind that comes when people realize they've been left out of a game. I could see the questions forming in their eyes. How long had Daniel and Brittany been working this angle, and who else had known? I didn't give them time to regain footing. "While we're all gathered," I said, "I'd like to present an alternative motion." I reached into my folder again, sliding a set of neatly bound pages toward the chairperson. "This proposal reallocates a portion of our annual surplus toward community scholarships for local students pursuing hospitality careers, funded directly from shareholder dividends, with matching contributions from those willing." It was the kind of initiative Henry would have championed. Visible, generous, and impossible to oppose without looking small. Tom spoke first. "I'll co-sponsor," Clara added. "So will I." 3 other hands followed within seconds. Daniel shifted in his chair. "This isn't on the agenda," he said. His voice was tight, the veneer of calm cracking. The chairperson glanced at him, then back at me. It can be added under new business. Given the level of support, I see no reason to delay. As the board discussed the logistics, I kept my focus steady. This wasn't just about the scholarships. It was about reminding everyone in the room that my stake here wasn't passive. I was an active force in shaping the resort's future in ways that had nothing to do with the personal ambitions of my son or his wife. Brittany sat back, her arms crossed, her gaze fixed somewhere just beyond me. If she'd been expecting me to shrink away after blocking their transfer, she was learning otherwise. Every word of this discussion was another quiet blow to their influence. When the vote passed, 7-2 in favor, I allowed myself the smallest smile. Not at the win itself, but at the realization that Daniel and Brittany had just been publicly sidelined without me ever raising my voice. The meeting moved on to minor agenda items, but the undercurrent remained. When it finally adjourned, board members gathered their things with new calculations in their expressions. Some stopped to shake my hand, others to ask about the scholarship details. I answered each question as if nothing unusual had happened, my tone warm and steady. Outside, the wind off the lake was sharp, scattering flurries across the parking lot. Daniel and Brittany walked ahead, their conversation low and quick. They didn't look back. I had come here today to block their play. I was leaving having done that, and set my own in motion. As the last of the board members drifted out, I lingered by the conference table, tucking my papers neatly into the leather folder. The chairperson approached, lowering her voice. "Margaret, the way you handled this, it was clean and effective." I thanked her, then asked if she might stay a few minutes longer. There was one final item I wanted documented. When Daniel and Brittany returned from the hallway, likely trying to regroup, I addressed the room again. "Before we adjourn entirely, I'd like the minutes to reflect a change in shareholder delegation." I set a single-page document in front of the chairperson. "This formally designates my voting proxy to Tom Willis should I be unable to attend future meetings. Effective immediately." Tom's brows rose, but he didn't hesitate to sign his acceptance. Clara gave me a quiet nod across the table. With that simple act, I ensured that no matter what maneuvering Daniel attempted in my absence, he'd be facing a united front, and one that owed him nothing. Daniel's voice was low, but the edge was there. "You're making this personal, Mom." I met his gaze without blinking. "No, Daniel. You made it personal when you tried to take what I built without asking." Brittany's expression tightened, her hand curling over her folder. The confidence she'd worn walking into this room had drained away, replaced by something sharper, awareness, maybe even fear. The chairperson added my proxy designation to the official record, stamped and initialed. The sound of that seal hitting the paper was as final as a door closing. When we finally stepped outside, the wind had picked up, pushing small drifts of snow across the pavement. Tom fell into step beside me. "You just cut their legs out from under them," he murmured. I smiled faintly. "No, Tom. I just reminded them I still know how to stand." Across the lot, Daniel opened the car door for Brittany, his movements clipped, mechanical. They didn't speak to me, didn't even try to mask the tension. For the first time in months, I felt no sting in their silence, only clarity. By the time I reached my own car, the snow was swirling harder, the lake beyond the lot a flat sheet of gray. I sat for a moment with the heater running, watching the flakes blur the view. Today had been about more than winning a vote or blocking a transfer. It was about reclaiming the narrative, making sure everyone in that room understood that my presence wasn't ornamental. It was decisive, and if Daniel and Brittany thought this was the end, they were mistaken. Justice wasn't a single moment. It was a pattern, and I intended to keep weaving it until the picture was complete. The days after the board meeting were oddly quiet. No phone calls from Daniel, no carefully worded emails from Brittany, just the usual winter stillness over the lake, broken only by the occasional groan of ice shifting beneath the surface. At first, I thought they might be planning another move, regrouping somewhere out of sight. But as the week went on, I began to realize the silence was its own statement. They were pulling back, licking their wounds, and perhaps, though I wouldn't bet on it, rethinking how far they could push me. I kept my routine steady. Morning tea at the kitchen table, the snow globe catching the early light. Afternoons spent at the library or walking the frozen shore. If they were waiting for me to relax my guard, they'd be disappointed. One afternoon, Emily stopped by unannounced. She brought a bag of groceries and a sheepish smile. "Thought you might like some company?" she said, slipping off her boots. We sat in the living room and for a while talked about nothing. Her classes, the dog she wanted to adopt, the stubborn leak in her apartment roof. Eventually, she leaned forward, her voice low. Dad's been quiet. Mom, too. It's strange. I didn't tell her about the proxy designation or the scholarship vote. Instead, I said, sometimes quiet is just another way of saying they've got nothing left to say. That night, I found myself at the window again, watching the dark water where the ice had broken near the dock. It struck me how much of my life had been built around staying put, being the steady point everyone else could move around. But steadiness wasn't the same as being stuck. The thought had been growing for weeks, maybe months, leaving. Not to run, not to hide, but to claim space that was mine, free from the constant maneuvering. I'd kept my ground here, but the battle had left a mark, and I could feel the pull of some place untouched by their shadow. I didn't make a decision that night, but I did pull a small suitcase from the closet, set it on the bed, and left it open. Sometimes preparing to go is its own kind of power. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the branches against the house. The sound was sharp but not unpleasant, like the air clearing after a storm. By the weekend, the open suitcase on my bed was no longer just an idea. I began placing things inside, slowly, deliberately. A wool sweater Henry had bought me on our last trip to Maine. The leather-bound journal I'd kept since the year he passed. A small tin of loose, leaf tea, the kind I couldn't count on finding anywhere else. I wasn't leaving tomorrow, or even next week. But I wanted the essentials ready so that when the moment came, I could move without hesitation. This wasn't about escape, it was about choice. On Monday morning, I called the post office to arrange for my lockbox to be transferred to a branch in another county. The clerk didn't ask why, and I didn't offer an explanation. Those documents, the ledger, the notarized refusal, the certified filings, would travel with me. My leverage wasn't staying behind for anyone to paw through. Next, I spoke with Richard Evans. I'll be away for a while, I told him. I want you to keep handling any correspondence from the board in my absence. He agreed, his tone calm but curious. Margaret, are you planning something I should know about? Not planning, I said. Just allowing for new possibilities. Emily stopped by again that week. She noticed the half-packed suitcase and raised an eyebrow. Going somewhere? Maybe, I answered, smiling. Sometimes you need to change the view to see things clearly. She didn't press, but I caught the flicker of relief in her eyes, like she knew distance might be the healthiest move for everyone. I began making a list of places I'd like to spend time. Small coastal towns, mountain cabins, even a few cities I'd only passed through. Each name felt like a door I could open when I was ready. The act of writing them down made the idea more real. Meanwhile, Daniel and Brittany's silence held. No uninvited visits, no surprise calls, no family dinners, meant to corner me into conversation. For the first time in years, I felt my days were truly my own. One evening, I sat by the fire with the snow globe in my hands. I shook it gently, watching the flakes swirl around the tiny dock. When they settled, the scene looked unchanged, but I knew the motion had happened. That was me now, still on the outside, but with an undercurrent of movement no one else could see. I zipped the suitcase halfway and set it against the wall. It could wait. For now, I was content knowing it was ready, like a promise to myself that the next chapter, whenever it began, would be entirely mine to write. The lake outside my window was different now, wider, calmer, edged with tall pines instead of bare oaks. I'd been in this small lakeside town in northern Wisconsin for 3 weeks, long enough for the rhythm of the place to settle into me. The mornings were cool and misty, the kind that made a cup of tea feel like a small ceremony. I rented a cottage with a screened porch and a narrow dock. The first night I slept here, the silence was so deep it felt like it had weight. No low hum of traffic, no creak of the old floorboards from my house back home, just the occasional call of a loon and the lap of water against the shore. Each day had its pattern. A walk into town for fresh bread and the local paper. An hour at the small library where the librarian Ruth always had a recommendation waiting. Afternoons spent by the dock, reading or simply letting my mind drift with the water. I'd brought only what I needed: the journal, a few photographs, my snow globe. The globe sat on a shelf near the window, catching the late afternoon sun. When I shook it now, it didn't feel like a reminder of what I'd survived, but of the stillness I'd earned. One morning, Ruth asked if I'd consider helping with a new project, a community reading program for children in town. It made me think of the scholarship initiative at the resort and how legacy didn't have to be grand to matter. I agreed without hesitation. In the evenings, I sometimes thought of Daniel and Brittany. Not with the tightness in my chest that used to come, but with a kind of distant curiosity. I wondered if they'd learned anything from what happened, or if they were simply circling, looking for their next opportunity. Either way, it no longer felt like my burden. Here, by this lake, I wasn't defined by what I'd had to defend. I was defined by what I chose to build next. By the end of my first month in Wisconsin, the reading program had its first gathering. We set up tables in the library's sunny front room, piles of donated books stacked high. Children spilled in with their parents, their laughter echoing against the shelves. I watched them pick out stories, some clutching their choices to their chests as if they'd found treasure. It reminded me of the nights I used to read to Daniel when he was small, before life and ambition pulled us into different orbits. Back then, the act felt simple, pure. Now, it felt like a way of giving something back without letting the past cloud the gift. I decided to create a small fund in my name, not tied to the resort or any boardroom, dedicated solely to keeping this program alive. The paperwork was straightforward, the decision was not. This was me putting my energy into something that couldn't be taken or twisted, no matter who tried. On quiet evenings, I'd sit on the porch with my journal, the lake darkening under the sky's last light. Sometimes I wrote about the board meeting, the proxy, the way Daniel's voice had sounded when he realized he'd lost control. Other times, I wrote about Ruth's smile, or the boy named Henry, no relation, who'd read his first book cover to cover at the library just that week. I never told Daniel or Brittany where I'd gone. If they wanted to find me, they'd have to look beyond the reach of their usual circles into a world where their influence didn't matter. I suspected they wouldn't bother. Power that can't be displayed often loses its shine. One late afternoon, as the sun turned the lake to gold, I shook the snow globe and set it back on the shelf. The flakes swirled, then slowly settled, revealing the tiny dock inside. Still there, still steady, no matter the storm. I'd kept my ground when it mattered. I'd chosen my own ground when I could. That, I realized, was the real legacy, not just surviving the battles, but building the peace that followed. Some stories end in grand gestures. Mine ended in the quiet certainty that I'd written the final chapter on my own terms.